black surgeon told she was in the wrong operating room. She signed off the life-saving procedure and left everyone in shock. The overhead lights burned white-hot against the stainless steel, bathing the operating room in a sterile, almost blinding glow. The steady beep of the heart monitor marked the fragile line between life and death. Then, everything froze. Dr. Richard Halloway's scalpel hovered mid-air, his pale blue eyes narrowing across the table. "You're in the wrong operating theater," he said, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the hum of machines. Every head turned toward her. Dr. Maya Carter didn't move. The only black surgeon in the room. Her gloved hands were poised above an open chest, the faint warmth of the patient's breath still fogging her face shield. She could feel the weight of the stairs, the quiet, complicit silence of the nurses. Richard's tone dripped with authority, but underneath, it carried something uglier, something she'd heard before. A monitor alarmed softly in the corner, and still no one spoke. Maya's heartbeat slowed to match the rhythm of the beeps. She didn't flinch, she didn't argue. Instead, she stepped back, her movements precise, deliberate. She stripped off one glove, reached for the clipboard, and in one fluid motion, signed her name across the procedure order. The black ink carved her authority into the page. Then she set her tools down, the metal clinking against the tray like the closing of a cell door. Without a word, she turned, pushed the swinging doors open, and walked out. Behind her, the room remained frozen, Richard's mouth half open, the nurses unsure whether to follow or to breathe. What had she just done? And why did it feel like the beginning of something they'd never forget? The doors swung shut behind her, sealing the operating room in silence. The echo of Maya's footsteps followed her down the hallway, a rhythm that was slow, deliberate, measured. But inside her, every beat was a war drum. The hospital's corridors were lined with framed photographs, rows of smiling surgeons in crisp white coats, shaking hands with governors, senators, donors. Every face in those frames shared a familiar look. Pale skin, silver hair, eyes that had never once looked at her as an equal. Maya Carter had learned long ago that brilliance wasn't enough. She'd graduated top of her class from Johns Hopkins, completed one of the most competitive residencies in the country, and published groundbreaking research on minimally invasive cardiac techniques. But here, in the pristine glass and marble fortress of St. Mark's Medical Center, she was still the black surgeon, the one they introduced with a pause, as if her presence needed explanation. She kept walking, past the nurses' station, where two interns whispered behind clipboards, past the wall of accolades listing distinguished surgeons of St. Mark's, a list where her name, despite her record, still sat near the bottom. Respect came here in measured doses, and always with the unspoken reminder, "You're lucky to be here." And then there was Richard Halloway. Dr. Halloway had been at St. Mark's longer than anyone could remember. His name was engraved on more plaques than the hospital had floors. He was the kind of man who carried his privilege like a tailored suit, clean, fitted, and invisible to those who wore the same. He shook hands with senators over golf, dined with donors at their country estates, and still somehow found the time to perform surgeries that were as much about reputation as saving lives. To Richard, hierarchy was sacred. Age over youth, men over women, white over everything else. He didn't say it outright. Men like him never did. But he didn't need to. It was in the way he dismissed her suggestions mid-surgery. In the way he praised her skill in front of patients but called her overzealous in board meetings. In the way he claimed credit for her innovations, chalking them up to collaborative effort. Maya had spent 3 years walking that tightrope. Too quiet, and they'd say she lacked presence. Too firm, and they'd brand her difficult. She mastered the art of precision. In her sutures, in her words, in every move she made inside and outside the operating theater. But precision came at a cost. She stopped by the glass wall of the cardiology wing, watching a team in blue scrubs rush a patient down the hall. The sight tugged her back to her first day at St. Mark's, the way she'd stood in this very spot, a mixture of awe and determination burning in her chest. She'd told herself then, "I will prove myself here, not for their acceptance, but for the patients," and she had. In her first year alone, she'd led 12 successful bypass surgeries with 0 post-op complications. She'd caught a rare diagnostic error that saved a senator's wife. She'd developed a protocol that cut surgery prep time by 30%. The numbers spoke louder than any speech she could give. But in the old boys' club of St. Mark's, numbers were just background noise. Richard's voice still rang in her ears. Wrong operating theater. The words weren't just an order. They were a reminder, a push back into the place they thought she belonged. She moved toward the staff lounge, the scent of stale coffee hanging in the air. Inside, 2 younger residents sat at a table, their eyes flicking up when she entered. One of them, a nervous-looking man with dark hair, muttered, "Rough day, huh?" His tone was light, but his gaze didn't meet hers. "Just another day at St. Mark's," Maya replied, her voice even. From the corner, a quiet laugh broke the tension. Dr. Leah Nguyen, one of the few allies Maya had here, set down her coffee mug. "Don't let him get in your head. Holloway's been protecting his turf since before I got here. And that was 10 years ago." Maya gave a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "This wasn't about turf, Leah. This was about reminding me who runs this place." Leah hesitated, then leaned in. "And what are you going to do about it?" Maya didn't answer. "Not yet," because she knew. Revenge wasn't something you announced. It was something you built, quietly, piece by piece. She sat down, staring out the lounge window at the city skyline. The glass reflected her own face back at her, the same calm, unreadable expression she wore in the OR. But behind it, something was shifting. She thought about Richard, about the way he had looked at her in that operating room. Not as a colleague, not even as a rival, but as an intruder. And she thought about how satisfying it would be when he realized she'd never been in the wrong room. The truth was, she'd been exactly where she needed to be, and the game had only just begun. The morning began with a stillness that didn't belong to a hospital. Maya stood in the scrub room, her hands under the warm rush of water, the scent of antiseptic sharp in her nose. Outside, the world was waking to coffee and morning traffic. Inside, the air was taut, every second heavy with the gravity of what was about to happen. This was the case they'd been talking about for weeks, the kind of high-profile surgery that carried both risk and prestige. The patient was Victor Langston, a billionaire energy magnate, with friends in Congress and a private security detail stationed in the lobby. His condition had worsened overnight. The only way to save him was an emergency quadruple bypass, and Maya had been tapped to lead it. It was supposed to be the culmination of everything she'd worked for, years of proving herself in a place that measured her by the shade of her skin before the sharpness of her scalpel. She'd studied the charts, memorized every twist of the coronary arteries, rehearsed the incisions in her mind until they played back like choreography. In the prep bay, nurses moved with quiet efficiency, their voices low, almost reverent. The gleam of surgical instruments under the overhead lights seemed to hum with potential. The anesthesiologist, a wiry man named Dr. Perez, checked the monitors one last time. "Vitals are stable," he said without looking up. Maya stepped into the OR. The air was cool, kept just shy of sterile frost. Every sound was amplified. The rustle of gowns, the snap of gloves, the faint hum of the ventilation system. She took her place at the head of the table, eyes fixed on the steady rise and fall of Langston's chest beneath the surgical drapes. "Scalpel," she said softly. It was handed to her without hesitation. The blade had barely hovered over the incision site when the doors banged open. Richard Holloway strode in, as though the room already belonged to him. His surgical mask hung loosely around his neck, his hair still damp from a morning shower. He didn't look at the patient. His eyes locked on Maya, and the air shifted. "What the hell are you doing in here?" The room went still. Even the heart monitor seemed to quiet. Maya didn't move. "I'm leading the procedure." As assigned, Richard stepped closer, his voice dropping but no less sharp. "You're in the wrong operating theater." He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The words carried the kind of weight that made people look away. One of the nurses fumbled with a tray, the instruments clinking like distant bells. Maya kept her eyes on him. "This is the Langston case, scheduled to start at." "I know exactly what case this is," he cut in, his tone heavy with dismissal. "And I know exactly who should be leading it." The subtext wasn't subtext at all. "You don't belong here. You've overstepped. You should know your place." The anesthesiologist looked down at his chart, pretending to read. The scrub tech shifted uncomfortably, her gaze fixed on the floor. No one spoke. Maya felt the heat crawl up her spine, but her face stayed composed. She'd been here before, not in this exact room, not on this exact day, but in moments where her capability was questioned before she'd even begun, where her credentials were less important than her complexion. Richard stepped into the space beside her, his voice low enough for only the immediate team to hear. "You'll step aside, now. I won't say it again." Her pulse thudded in her ears. She thought about the patient, about the hours of preparation, about the quiet pride she'd felt walking into this room, knowing she'd earned her place at the table. And then she thought about the nurse's averted eyes. The silence in the room was as loud as any accusation. It wasn't just Richard's voice that pushed her out. It was the chorus of their inaction, the unspoken agreement that his word would stand. She lowered the scalpel. The decision was clinical, surgical. One smooth step back, one glance at the clipboard, one stroke of ink across the page. Her name, in black and final, as the surgeon of record. Then she set the scalpel down, the sound of metal on metal ringing like a verdict. Richard didn't speak. He didn't need to. The flicker in his eyes was victory. Maya turned, walked toward the double doors, and pushed them open. The corridor beyond was colder than the OR, but the air tasted sharper, cleaner. She kept her stride steady, even as the tremor of adrenaline burned through her veins. Behind her, the room began to move again, voices rising, instruments clinking, orders being given. Richard's voice was already filling the space she'd left, but in her mind, the image of his face, that smug certainty, was already being dissected piece by piece. Because Maya knew something he didn't. This wasn't the end of the surgery, it was the beginning of hers. The hours after the operating room confrontation unfolded like a slow bleed. Maya moved through the corridors with a composure so precise it felt carved from stone. Every step, every turn of her head, every clipped instruction to interns was deliberate, a performance so polished no one could accuse her of losing control. But inside, the heat was constant. She'd spent years learning how to mask it, how to keep her voice level when someone explained her own research back to her, how to keep her smile still when a donor assumed she was a nurse, how to keep her hands steady when a colleague called her girl in the middle of a surgery. And now, she was keeping it again. The hospital was alive with its usual chaos, gurneys squealing over polished tile, the hum of conversation spilling from nurses' stations, the sharp bark of a page over the intercom. But for Maya, every sound was background to the echo of Richard's voice. "You're in the wrong operating theater." The whispers began before she reached the elevator. Two interns by the cardiology wing bent their heads together, speaking in tones just low enough to pretend they weren't about her. A nurse glanced at her, then away, too quickly to be natural. By the time she reached the break room, Richard's voice was already there, carried on the low ripple of laughter. He was leaning against the counter, coffee in hand, telling some story to Dr. Reeves, the vascular chief. Whatever it was, it ended with Richard throwing his head back in a laugh that seemed designed to fill the room. The moment he saw her, the smile didn't falter. If anything, it sharpened. "Maya," he said, drawing her name out just long enough to claim it. "How's the rest of your morning going?" "Productive," she said, moving past him to the coffee pot. The cup filled slowly, the steady stream masking the beat of silence between them. "That's good," Richard said. "It's important to know when to step back and let the right person do the job." Reeves chuckled under his breath. Neither man noticed the way Maya's fingers tightened slightly on the cup before she set it down. She didn't answer, didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She just took her coffee and walked out, leaving his smirk in the doorway behind her. By noon, she was back in her office, the blinds drawn halfway against the afternoon light. Her desk was lined with patient files, but the one that held her attention wasn't on the stack. It was open on her laptop, Victor Langston's chart. She'd memorized it in the days leading up to the surgery, but now, scanning it again, her mind searched for something else. Not medical notes, political ones. Langston's connections were no secret. The hospital's board had been whispering about the publicity this surgery would bring for weeks. But that wasn't what caught her eye. It was the timestamp on the prep schedule,
The surgery had been slotted 3 hours later than protocol recommended for his condition. 3 hours that could have tipped the scales from complicated to critical. And according to the log, the delay had nothing to do with equipment, staff, or the patient himself. It was administrative. Administrative meant scheduling, and scheduling meant Richard. She leaned back in her chair, the quiet hum of the computer fan filling the space. Langston's condition had been fragile when she walked into that OR. Any delay was dangerous, but the fact that the delay was deliberate, and not disclosed, made it more than dangerous. It made it a liability. A knock on the door broke her focus. Leah stepped in, closing it behind her. "I heard what happened this morning," she said softly. "I'm fine," Maya replied. "No, you're not." Leah sat across from her. "Listen, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but the only reason they wanted you on the Langston case was because you've done this exact procedure under emergency conditions before. Holloway hasn't, not in over a decade." Maya's eyes met hers. "Then why pull me off?" Leah hesitated. "Because if something went wrong, he didn't want to be the one standing in your shadow." It landed like a cold blade between her ribs. The truth was clear now. Richard hadn't just humiliated her, he'd gambled with the patient's life to protect his own standing. And the irony, he'd done it by sidelining the only person who could have made sure there was no gamble at all. Maya kept her voice even. "Did you know about the scheduling delay?" Leah's silence was answer enough. When she left, the office felt different. The walls, the desk, the muted hum of the air vent, it all seemed sharper, more defined, as if every detail had stepped into focus. Richard thought the morning's humiliation was the final move. He thought she'd swallow it, as she had all the small cuts before. But this wasn't a small cut. This was malpractice waiting to happen, and he'd put the knife in her hand, thinking she wouldn't use it. She closed Langston's file, the click of the laptop echoing in the room. Her day continued in silence. Each interaction, a hallway nod, a clipped greeting, a side glance, folding neatly into the file in her mind labeled leverage.
By the time the sun dipped low and the city lights flickered on beyond her window, she had everything she needed to know. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to confront him in front of the team. All she had to do was wait for the right incision, and when she made it, there'd be no stitching it back together. The hospital at night was a different animal. During the day, it roared. Phones ringing, footsteps pounding, doors swinging open and shut, but now, the halls whispered. Shadows stretched long under fluorescent light, and every sound was magnified. The squeak of a gurney wheel, the click of a keyboard, the low hum of a vending machine. Maya sat in her office, the door closed, the blinds half drawn. Her desk was a field of open files, the glow of her laptop spilling over them. Langston's chart sat at the center. She scrolled slowly, her eyes tracing each line like a surgeon's blade following a scar. She wasn't looking for mistakes. Not anymore. She was looking for something far more dangerous. Leverage. And that's when she found it. It was buried deep in the hospital's electronic health record system, in a section most doctors never bothered with. Surgeon of record. Procedure authorization. It was the kind of administrative formality most people clicked through without reading. But Maya read everything. The text was blunt, almost cold. The surgeon of record must approve all changes to procedure, staff, or schedule. Without this signature, no operation may proceed. Her fingers hovered over the trackpad. This wasn't just policy. This was law. And because she had been assigned the Langston case before Richard yanked it from her, she was still, legally, the surgeon of record. That meant if Richard wanted to change a stitch, adjust the anesthesia plan, swap out a scrub nurse, or even shift the timing, he needed her. Without her signature, the surgery stopped. She leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking under her weight. Her reflection stared back at her from the darkened window. The same calm expression she wore in the OR, but with something sharper beneath it. It wasn't anger anymore. It was calculation. A knock at the door pulled her back. Leah slipped inside, closing it quickly behind her. "You're still here." Maya gestured to the laptop. "Couldn't sleep." Leah hesitated, then stepped closer. "You hear about Langston? His vitals tanked after the surgery. He's stable now, but it was close. Too close." Maya didn't respond. Leah frowned. "I don't know what Holloway was thinking. You were the obvious choice. You've done this procedure twice in emergencies, and both times the patients were walking out in under 2 weeks. Maya looked up from the screen. You think he made the delay himself? Leah hesitated, then nodded. Board pressure, media optics. He wanted the case, no matter the risk. Maya's voice was quiet. Then he'll want to keep it. And if he wants to keep it, she tapped the policy on the screen. He'll have to come to me. Leah leaned over to read it. Her eyes widened. Maya, I know exactly what it is. Maya cut in. It's the only scalpel I need. Leah searched her face. You're going to make him pay. Not yet. Maya closed the laptop with a soft click. The key to surgery is timing. Cut too soon, and the patient bleeds out. Wait too long, and they die anyway. The trick, she stood, smoothing her coat, is knowing the exact moment to cut. Over the next few days, Maya became invisible, at least on the surface. She attended rounds, updated charts, signed off on routine cases, but in the background, she was watching, waiting, and then the request started. First it was a staffing change. Richard wanted a different scrub nurse for a follow-up procedure. Policy required Maya's signature. She let the form sit on her desk for 6 hours, before sending it back, signed, with a note, reviewed and approved. Ensure proper documentation of change in OR log. Next it was a request to adjust the surgical plan for a post-op complication. She waited until just before the scheduled procedure to approve it, forcing Richard to stall his prep until her green light came through. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but to Richard, who was used to commanding an OR with a snap of his fingers, it was maddening. One afternoon, she passed him in the hallway. His smile was thin, his eyes sharp. You've been hard to reach, he said. I've been busy, she replied, her tone even. Lots of approvals to process. His jaw flexed. You know, Carter, the faster these things move, the better it is for the patient. She stopped, meeting his gaze. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you pulled me off a case I was qualified to lead. For a moment they just stared at each other. Then she stepped around him, and kept walking, leaving the echo of her words hanging in the air. By the end of the week, Richard had sent her 5 separate requests. Each one was a small incision into his pride. Each one reminded him that no matter how loudly he barked orders in the OR, he couldn't move without her pen. The beauty of it was that no one else saw the game. To the rest of the hospital, it was just paperwork, protocol. But Maya knew, and Richard knew, that every delay, every forced wait, was her hand on the scalpel, pressing just hard enough to sting. Late one night, she sat alone in her office, the hospital quiet around her. She opened Langston's file again, scrolling to the authorization form. Her name sat there in black ink, unshakable. This was her operating table now, and Richard was the patient. She would decide when, and how, to cut, and when she did, there'd be no saving him. By the next week, the hospital had no idea a war was being fought inside its walls. There were no shouting matches in corridors, no heated confrontations in front of patients. On the surface, everything ran as it always had. Richard still commanded operating rooms, still charmed donors at luncheons, still strolled the halls with the confidence of a man untouchable. But underneath, the ground was shifting. Maya made sure of it. Every request Richard sent her way was handled with meticulous care, the kind of care that took time. If he wanted a change approved, she read every line of supporting documentation. Twice, she asked for clarifications, additional notes, confirmation from secondary sources, and she did it all in the name of patient safety. She knew exactly how it looked, a diligent surgeon following protocol to the letter. No one could accuse her of obstruction. But to Richard, who was used to moving at the speed of his own ego, it was agony. It started small, a request for an additional post-op scan. She returned it at the end of the day, citing the need to confirm the radiology schedule. A staffing change. She asked for HR's written confirmation before signing. A modification to an incision approach. She required 3 peer-reviewed sources to justify it. Always polite, always professional, always enough to make him wait. The delays didn't just slow his work, they bled into his reputation. Cases began starting late. Recovery time stretched. Nurses whispered about his new habit of pacing outside the OR, checking his watch, waiting for a signature that wasn't coming yet. And then Maya began feeding the hospital grapevine, carefully, strategically, over coffee with Dr. Nagin. She mentioned how thorough she had to be lately, given some of the oversights she'd found in recent surgical prep notes. In a casual conversation with the chief medical officer, she expressed concern over rushed decision-making in certain high-profile cases, without ever naming Richard outright. At a board meeting, when discussing procedural compliance, she volunteered to help ensure all documentation matched policy, adding, "You'd be surprised how often critical steps get skipped." It wasn't accusation, it was suggestion, and suggestion, in the right ears, spread faster than fact. One afternoon, Richard cornered her outside the OR. His smile was sharp, but his eyes gave him away. "You seem to be enjoying your little gatekeeping role." She tilted her head, expression calm. "I'm just following hospital policy. You wouldn't want me to cut corners, would you?" His jaw flexed. "You're slowing down my cases. I'm ensuring patient safety," she replied smoothly. "And if you're feeling slowed down, maybe there's a reason." He held her gaze for a long beat before stepping aside, but she'd seen it, the crack in the armor. From then on, she pushed further. She began CCing higher-ups on every approval email, a silent witness to every request, every change, every delay. If Richard asked for something unusual, she'd highlight it in bold and request clarification for the record. In staff meetings, when Richard reported on his cases, Maya would ask innocent questions. Was that procedure change documented? Did anesthesia confirm the adjustment before you started? Was the patient's consent updated for that modification? Each question landed like a drop of cold water on his skin, and each time, she made sure the rest of the room heard it. She wasn't accusing him of negligence. She was planting the idea that he might be negligent, and the more he bristled, the more that idea took root. The shift was slow, but she felt it. Nurses began double-checking his orders. Residents started asking her for second opinions, even when he was the attending. The board called 2 informal reviews of his recent cases. Nothing came of them yet, but the whisper had become a hum, and the hum was getting louder. Late one evening, Maya sat in her office, reviewing a fresh request from Richard, a last-minute change to a donor's surgery. She stared at it for a moment, then picked up the phone. "Dr. Matthews," she said when the chief medical officer answered. "Can I run something by you? Just making sure we're aligned before I approve a modification this close to the operation." She let the conversation play out exactly as she wanted, her tone neutral, her words careful, her concern purely procedural. But when she hung up, she knew Matthews would be thinking about it all night. Richard had no idea how small the net around him had become. Maya didn't need to pull him down herself. She was letting the weight of his own habits, his own arrogance, do the work. All she had to do was tighten the threads, until there was no slack left. And when the moment came, when the whole room was watching, she would pull. The morning of the surgery began like any other, at least to anyone who wasn't paying attention. The sun hadn't yet broken the horizon, but the hospital was already alive. Nurses in crisp scrubs pushed supply carts down the hall. Orderlies wheeled beds into pre-op bays. The low murmur of voices mixed with the distant hiss of the ventilation system. Maya arrived without ceremony. No grand entrance, no indication that today was different, but beneath the steady rhythm of her steps was something sharpened. Today was the day. She'd known it since Richard's name appeared on the schedule, for a second high-profile operation in as many weeks. This one wasn't just big, it was explosive. The patient was Margaret Stone, a real estate heiress whose foundation had donated millions to the hospital. Her procedure, an emergency valve replacement, was set to be followed by a press conference in the lobby. Cameras, reporters, board members, all of them waiting to applaud the man who saved her life. That man, Richard assumed, would be him. In the staff lounge, she found him holding court with 2 junior surgeons. His laughter was as loud as the coffee grinder. "Don't worry," he said, leaning against the counter. "It's all about confidence. You walk into that OR, like you own it, and they'll never question you." His eyes caught hers over the rim of his cup. For just a second, there was that glint, the same one he'd had the morning he told her she was in the wrong operating theater. "Hey, Carter," he said, voice smooth. "You got the paperwork ready for me?" She smiled, just enough to be polite. Of course. In truth, the paperwork was sitting in her office, unsigned. She had reviewed it twice, noted every deviation from protocol, every risk he'd chosen to gloss over, and now, she carried it in her bag, the pages crisp,
the ink pen clipped to the top. They walked to the OR together, his stride full of swagger, hers unhurried. He chatted with the anesthesiologist, made a joke to the scrub nurse, checked his watch. Inside, the room was already prepped. The patient lay under the sterile drapes, monitors tracing steady green lines across the screens. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and cold steel. Richard gestured toward the clipboard in her hand. "All right, Carter, let's get this signed so we can get started." She stepped to the foot of the table, her eyes scanning the room, the instruments lined in perfect order, the team waiting for the signal, the press of quiet expectation in the air. Then she looked down at the patient, her breathing slow and even beneath the mask. She didn't speak, not yet. She walked the length of the table, checking the IV lines, the anesthesia setup, the incision site, marked in purple. Every move was deliberate, precise, the kind of thoroughness no one could fault. Richard cleared his throat. "We're on a schedule here." Finally, she picked up the pen. Her hand moved steadily across the page, until it reached the line marked primary surgeon. She paused, just long enough for the silence to thicken. Then in clean, unhurried strokes, she wrote her own name. The sound of the pen scratching the paper seemed deafening in the stillness. When she was done, she set the clipboard down on the instrument table. Her gloves whispered against the steel as she stepped back. Richard blinked. "What are you doing?" Her voice was calm, following protocol. "As the originally assigned surgeon, I'm confirming myself as the lead for this procedure." His jaw tightened. "You can't just—" "I can," she interrupted softly, "and I have." The scrub nurse's eyes darted between them. The anesthesiologist froze, hands hovering over the machine. "You need to leave," Richard said, the edge in his voice rising. "Now." Maya didn't move. "Without my signature, no one can legally proceed. And now that my name is on that form, you can't proceed without me." For a moment, the only sound was the steady beep of the monitor. Then, like a shift in air pressure, the reality settled over the room. No one moved. No one reached for an instrument. Every person in that space knew the rules, knew that breaking them wasn't just a violation, it was career suicide. Richard's face flushed, but there was nothing he could do. Not here, not now. She stepped back toward the doors. "You might want to call the board," she said quietly. "They'll need to approve any change." And then she walked out. The doors swung closed behind her, sealing in the stunned silence. In the corridor, the tension broke into a quiet hum. Voices on radios, hurried footsteps toward the OR, the first murmurs of what had just happened spreading through the hospital like wildfire. By the time she reached her office, the calls had already started. Senior administrators, board members, the chief medical officer, all of them wanting to know why one of their biggest surgeries was at a standstill. She told them the truth, calmly, precisely. She cited the policy number. She explained her legal authority as the originally assigned surgeon. She detailed the procedural risks Richard had overlooked in his planning, and she made sure every word was recorded in the meeting notes. Within the hour, the board had no choice but to halt the operation. Margaret Stone would be stabilized, rescheduled, reassigned to Maya. The scandal was instant. The press conference was canceled. Donors whispered about internal issues. The board called an emergency review of surgical leadership, and Richard Halloway, the man who had once thrown her out of an OR in front of a full team, was now explaining to that same board why he couldn't proceed without her. Maya didn't attend the meeting. She didn't need to. Her work was already done. The fallout came faster than even Maya expected. By the end of the week, Richard's name was no longer on the surgical schedule. His office door, once always ajar to passers-by and political allies, was now closed, blinds drawn, and in the glass-walled conference rooms, people who used to hang on his every word now spoke in low clip tones. When his name came up, if they spoke it at all, the board called it a temporary suspension pending investigation. But in a hospital like St. Mark's, those words were just the polite phrasing for a career already on life support. No one said it out loud, but the truth moved quickly through the halls. The heiress surgery had been delayed because of him. Protocol had been broken, policy ignored, and worse, he'd been stopped cold in the operating room by the very woman he'd tried to humiliate. For the first time in years, the corridors didn't feel as heavy under Maya's feet. There were still glances, still whispers, but they had shifted. Where once there had been quiet dismissal, now there was something else. Respect, caution, even admiration. 2 days later, the email arrived. An offer from Westlake Medical, one of the top cardiac centers in the country, with a track record for diversity and a reputation for letting talent, not politics, lead the way. The salary was generous, but it wasn't the number that caught her eye. It was the language. We believe you'll find our operating rooms are built on collaboration, not competition. We want you to lead, not fight to be heard. She didn't answer immediately. She read it twice, then set it aside. The next morning, she arrived at St. Mark's for what she knew would be one of her last surgeries here. No fanfare, just the quiet focus that had always carried her through. The patient was a young father with a congenital defect, his wife holding their baby in the waiting area. The surgery was delicate, the kind that demanded steady hands and absolute precision. This time, the team around her wasn't looking through her, or past her, or waiting for someone else to take the lead. They moved with her rhythm, followed her cues, trusted her judgment. The OR was alive with quiet efficiency, instruments passed without hesitation, instructions carried out without question. She worked in silence, the hum of the monitors, matching the measured beat of her heart. When the final suture was tied, and the incision closed, she glanced at the screen. The patient's vitals, steady, strong, another life saved. Another proof that skill had nothing to do with the color of the hands holding the scalpel. When she stepped out of the OR, stripping off her gloves, she caught Leia waiting in the hall. "Westlake?" Leia asked. Maya smiled faintly. "Thinking about it. You'd be crazy not to take it." "Maybe," Maya said, "but I want to leave here on my terms." And she did. Her last day at St. Mark's came quietly, without a farewell party or a speech. She didn't need one. The victory wasn't in applause, it was in knowing she'd walked into this place underestimated, and she was walking out untouchable. Weeks later, she stood in a new operating room. The walls were a soft blue instead of stark white, the light a little warmer, the air less cold. Around her was a team as diverse as the city itself. Men, women, different ages, different backgrounds, all with the same singular focus. The patient on the table. The scalpel fit in her hand, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Her voice was steady. "Let's begin." And as the first incision was made, the rhythm was hers again, calm, precise, and unstoppable. Sometimes, the sharpest blade isn't the one you swing in anger, it's the one you hold steady, the one you guide with precision, the one they never see coming, until it's already cut them to the bone. Maya didn't raise her voice. She didn't throw accusations in crowded hallways or demand apologies under bright lights. She moved like a surgeon, deliberate, exact, every decision calculated to hit where it hurt most, and leave no wound on herself. Richard thought power was about volume, about presence, about making sure the room felt his weight. But real power is when you don't have to announce yourself at all. Because the rules, the skill, and the truth are already on your side. It's easy to imagine revenge as an explosion, loud, fiery, undeniable, but the most devastating victories are often the quiet ones, the ones that leave your opponent standing in the wreckage, realizing too late that every step they took toward you was one you'd placed for them. In the end, Richard wasn't ruined by Maya's rage. He was ruined by his own arrogance, wrapped neatly in the policies he thought he could bend. And that's why her victory will last longer than any public humiliation could. Because some scars never fade, especially the ones carved in silence. Now, I want to hear from you. If you were in Maya's position, faced with discrimination, so blatant it dares you to act, would you fight it head on, or would you wait, and cut only once? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share your own stories of standing your ground, or of winning without ever raising your voice. And if you want more stories where justice finds its mark, sometimes in the quietest ways, make sure you're subscribed, because there are a lot more battles like this one. and not all of them are fought in the open.